Hey, 42 here. In 2006, Mexican beer brand Dos Equis launched an ad campaign starring Jonathan Goldsmith as the so-called most interesting man in the world. The campaign was a huge success, almost single-handedly transforming Dos Equis into one of the most popular imported beers in the US and inspiring countless internet memes that are still popular even today, almost 20 years later. Goldsmith claims to have based a character he played for almost 10 years on his friend Fernando Lamas. As a world-famous actor and director who spent his spare time marrying Hollywood starlets and sailing around the world in a private yacht, Lamas was indeed a pretty interesting guy. But compared to the subject of today's video, his life was about as exciting as sitting on the sofa in your pants, watching reruns of Gardener's World. The person we're covering today lived a life so utterly spectacularly, mind-bogglingly incredible that it's hard to believe it really happened. Now, that might sound like a bit of classic YouTube hyperbole, but seriously, if anything, I'm underselling it. During his 83 years on God's green earth, this man was shot no fewer than 7 times, losing an eye and a hand in the process. He survived 4 plane crashes, amputated 2 of his own fingers, tunneled out of a high-security Italian prison, and publicly insulted one of the world's deadliest dictators at a dinner party, and lived to tell the tale. He also spoke 4 languages, excelled in a variety of sports, married 2 women with a combined 14 names, and was awarded the Victoria Cross. Oh, and he may well have been the illegitimate son of the King of Belgium. Intrigued? You should be, because this is a story of the soldier who couldn't be killed, the aristocrat who charmed European high society, the diplomat who changed the course of the Second World War, and quite possibly the laddiest lad to ever lad the earth. This is the story of Sir Adrian Carton de Vuillard. Addo is an all-in-one management software that provides entrepreneurs with a range of applications to simplify the day-to-day management of their business. I use a bunch of different business applications that are all really pricey individually, so having them all under one roof with Addo is a game changer for me. The first Addo application is free for life, with unlimited hosting and support. They also offer a free personalized domain name for 1 year. I used Addo's website builder to create a stunning website for 42, and it absolutely shocked me how quick it was. What I particularly like about Addo's website builder is the ability to very easily change the template and color scheme, and if I upload my logo, Addo's AI will automatically set my brand colors for me. After building it, it's so easy to customize your site however you wish. Simply drag and drop blocks and then customize each block with images, text, videos, etc. I really appreciate the built-in stock image library, which allows me to effortlessly build out my site with super high quality images in minutes, and I know I can use them all royalty-free. Also, Addo's grid system allows me to easily rearrange objects in seconds. So click the link in the description to try out Addo for yourself today. Don't miss out, and a big thanks to Addo for sponsoring this video. Adrian Carton de Vuillard was born on the 5th of May 1880 in Brussels, Belgium. His paternal family were Belgian aristocrats, his father being a knight of the Belgian Legion, though rumours at the time of his birth suggested Adrian may actually have been the illegitimate son of King Leopold II of Belgium. Whether or not he really was every fantasy author's favourite kind of character, a royal bastard, we'll likely never know, but the very fact it was even suggested gives you a pretty good idea of the kinds of circles his family moved in, as does the fact that his first cousin Henry would become the Prime Minister of Belgium in 1920. The de Vuillards moved around a lot during Adrian's childhood, eventually settling in Egypt where his father practiced law. At the age of 11, Adrian was shipped off to boarding school in southern England, but he was never a great student. It wasn't so much that he didn't have the brains, more that he simply wasn't interested in academia. He loved the great outdoors and anything remotely resembling physical exercise. And so instead of studying, he focused his efforts on various sporting activities, captaining both the cricket and football teams, and winning individual awards in tennis, squash, and billiards. In most schools, such sporting excellence would have meant guaranteed status as one of the cool kids, but that wasn't the case for Adrian. Despite his near-flawless English, he was still very much a foreigner in an English boarding school, which is about the most English place imaginable. Some things, like the rules of a soggy biscuit, just can't be understood by outsiders. Still, Adrian made it through school unscathed, and despite his unimpressive academic achievements, his connections saw him ultimately go on to study law at Oxford. But not even studying at one of the most prestigious universities in the world could convince him to stay indoors and read books. Spending the vast majority of his time either playing sports or getting drunk, his academic performance nosedived. And after failing his end-of-year exams in his first year, he was already looking for a way out. That way out presented itself in 1899 with the outbreak of the Second Boer War. Like many young men before him, Adrian had always been fascinated with a kind of romanticised version of the armed services, and he quickly resolved to drop out of university and enlist. There was, however, one small problem with that plan. Actually, there were three. One, his father wanted him to become a lawyer and would never sanction such a drastic career change. Two, he wasn't old enough to enlist. And three, fighting in the British Army was going to be somewhat tricky in light of the fact that he wasn't actually British. In the end, he overcame all of these obstacles by simply signing up in secret under a false, slightly older and significantly more British identity. Before the year was out, Trooper Carton, as he called himself, was on his way to South Africa to fight. Nobody knew it at the time, but one of the most remarkable military careers in history had just begun. For all that he would go on to achieve over the following 40 years or so, Adrian's first taste of service was actually a little underwhelming, mostly involving months of training and very little action. And when a serious skirmish finally arrived, it was both brief and painful. During a routine patrol, Adrian's unit were fired upon by Boer sharpshooters. He took 2 bullets, one in the groin and another in the stomach. Being shot is inconvenient at the best of times, but for Adrian it was an absolute catastrophe, because the severity of his wounds meant he was sent back to England immediately to convalesce. Not only did that mean his first taste of war was over before it had really begun, it also meant that his parents found out that rather than studying law in the cosy confines of Oxford University, their precious little son had been secretly fighting in a war 6,000 miles away. But Adrian's brief soldierly stint had taught him something extremely important about warfare. He absolutely bloody loved it. After a long stay in a luxurious hospital on Park Lane in London that would become very familiar to him in the coming decades, he visited his father in Cairo to beg for permission to become a soldier full-time. After much deliberation, his father agreed, and the rest is history. The Second Boer War came to a close in 1902, at which point Adrian was transferred to India. But when he arrived, he was bitterly disappointed by a distinct lack of enemies to fight. He did see some limited action, but most of his time was spent playing various sports, especially pig sticking. In case you aren't familiar with the noble sport of pig sticking, it's an extremely complex and technical sport in which players stick spears into pigs. Yeah. That's not great, is it? After India, Adrian returned to Britain, and with pitifully few wars to get involved in at the time, he took the opportunity to get a bit of life admin done. In 1907, he formally became a British citizen by swearing the Oath of Allegiance to Edward VII. And the following year, he got married to Countess Frederica Maria, Carolina, Henrietta, Rosa, Sabina, Franziska, Fugger von Babenhausen. Despite having a name that reads like a lyric from Mambo No. 5, Countess Frederica was apparently just one person, and the two were married in 1908. By the way, one of those frankly ridiculous number of names, Fugger, might be familiar to you. The House of Fugger is a German banking dynasty that dominated European business in the 15th and 16th centuries. One of its many famous sons was Jacob Fugger, considered by some historians to have been the richest man who ever lived. In other words, Adrian Carton de Wiart may have shunned his aristocratic roots to become a soldier, but in marrying a Fugger, he proved that he still moved in influential circles. I don't know, some motherfuckers get all the luck. Adrian was either completely unromantic or intensely private. In later life, he wrote an autobiography, and neither of the two women he ultimately married even gets a name check. Maybe he was worried about exceeding his word count with all of those names. Despite his status as a newlywed, Adrian had zero intention of settling down into a nice, quiet family life. Instead, spending the majority of his time playing polo and travelling around the various great houses of Europe, where he hunted, fished, and dined with local nobility. But this life of leisure came to an abrupt end in 1914 when he received some rather bad news. The economy in Egypt had taken a hit and his father had gone bankrupt. Up until this point, Adrian had essentially been a kind of Edwardian-era trust fund kid, living off of the family fortune. He'd become a soldier not to make some fast cash, but for the simple reason that he loved it. But with the magic money tree no longer producing its fat green leaves, soldiering suddenly represented the only way he had of putting food on the table. And so he sold off most of his possessions, grabbed the nearest newspaper, and set about trying to find himself a war to fight in. The pickings were slim as far as major conflicts went, but early 20th century Britain could always be relied on to be at war with at least someone. Sure enough, the Brits were engaged in a minor campaign against the dervishes in far-flung British Somaliland, now part of modern-day Somalia. So Adrian naturally signed up immediately. He joined up with the Somaliland Camel Corps, an elite unit of camel-based cavalry, to fight the dervish leader, a man rather ominously known as the Mad Mullah. On paper, the chance to ride a few camels and get shot at a bit should have been perfect for our man Adrian, but on his way to Africa, he received even more terrible news. Britain had declared war on Germany. Now, when I say that this was terrible news, I don't mean that Adrian was devastated to hear of the outbreak of the First World War. No, he was just absolutely gutted for the simple reason that he was already on his way to Somaliland and he wasn't going to be a part of it. In his own words, he felt like he was playing in a village cricket match instead of a test. And if that little analogy doesn't prove that he was about as British as crumpets by this point, then nothing will. Still, with little other choice, he continued on to East Africa, and in what was to become his trademark style, he was soon in the thick of the fighting. Unfortunately, in what was also soon to become his trademark style, it wasn't too long before he got shot. It happened during a raid on a dervish encampment near Mount Shimbiris. The dervishes were holed up in a fort, and unsurprisingly, it was Adrian who led the British charge against it. Somehow he made it all the way up to the entrance without being hit. But just as he was about to dive inside, he was shot. Twice. In the face. Now, I've never read Grey's Anatomy, but I'm pretty sure that the human head contains some fairly important equipment, and being shot in it is typically an effective way to make yourself very dead. But miraculously, Adrian survived. However, his injuries were devastating. One bullet had torn through his ear and the other had lodged itself behind his eye. The ear one wasn't such an issue and it was soon patched up, but the eye was a different story. Adrian was sent to Egypt where local doctors informed him that it would need to be removed, but he refused. You might assume he resisted the operation because he thought that his eye could be saved, or perhaps he was afraid his career would be over if he allowed the operation to go ahead. But no, that wasn't it. His reasons were more batshit insane. You see, he'd realised that if he refused the operation, he would be sent back to England. And if he was sent back to England, he'd have half a chance of getting involved where the real fighting was happening, the battlefields of the First World War. The plan, bonkers though it was, worked perfectly. Adrian was put on a ship back to England, and soon afterwards he found himself in the very same Park Lane hospital where he'd been treated during the Second Boer War. But the doctors there had exactly the same opinion as the ones in Egypt. The eye was going to have to come out. Fast. This time, Adrian agreed. For 99.9999999% of human beings, this would be where the story ends. You don't need to be Rambo's optometrist to know that fully functioning eyes are a fairly important asset for a soldier. But Adrian Carton de Weir wasn't most human beings. In fact, I'm not convinced he was human at all. Because just 4 weeks after having his left eye plucked out with the medical equivalent of an ice cream scoop, he rocked up at the evaluation board requesting permission to be sent to the front lines in France. At first, the board flatly refused, but Adrian was prepared to get down on his knees and beg if he had to. And eventually, the board gave in, on one condition: that he have a glass eye fitted. Adrian agreed immediately, and soon enough he was passed fit for service. The glass eye didn't last long though. Rumour has it he threw it out of the window of his taxi home after meeting the medical board. He would never wear a glass eye again, instead favouring an eye patch that gave him the look of a military pirate. In February 1915, just over a month after having his eye removed, Adrian arrived in France at the so-called Western Front, where he quickly discovered that, contrary to popular belief, things weren't very quiet at all. In fact, over the following 3 years, he would be involved in many of the biggest and bloodiest battles in human history, including the battles of the Somme, Passchendaele, Cambrai, Arras, and the Second Battle of Ypres. You probably won't be surprised to hear that during these various scraps, Adrian took more than a few bullets and suffered multiple devastating injuries. He was shot through the skull and ankle at the Somme, he took a bullet to the hip at Passchendaele, another in the ankle at Cambrai, and one through the ear at Arras. After almost all of these injuries, Adrian found himself back in the hospital on Park Lane that was fast becoming something of a second home to him. By the end of the First World War, staff at the hospital had begun keeping a room reserved for him on the top floor, even going as far as to have a set of monogrammed silk pajamas made for him. Bad as these various wounds were, the worst injury he suffered in the First World War was actually the first. In the summer of 1915, during the Second Battle of Ypres, he was shot through the hand. The bullet tore through his palm, leaving 2 fingers hanging on by a few scraps of flesh. When field doctors refused to remove the dangling digits, Adrian took matters into his own hands, literally, and tore the fingers off himself. He would spend most of the rest of 1915 in the hospital at Park Lane, where doctors carried out a series of operations with hopes of saving the hand, but ultimately it was all in vain, and the hand was amputated in December. Being the absolute nutjob that he was, Adrian refused to go under general anaesthetic, staying awake throughout the entire operation, breathing nitrous oxide, otherwise known as laughing gas. I should probably point out that when he wasn't doing his best Terminator impression, Adrian Corton Nouillard was actually a pretty remarkable soldier. Before the First World War was over, he'd been promoted to Major and had become something of a living legend, famed throughout the armed forces for his remarkable bravery and unwavering enthusiasm to put himself in the thick of the fighting whenever he got the chance. For most people, the end of the First World War was a blessed relief, but Adrian was genuinely disappointed to have to go home. I think he said it best in what is probably his most famous quote. When summing up the conflict during which he lost his hand and was shot 5 times, all he had to say was this: "Frankly, I enjoyed the war." Like I said, the man wasn't human. The interwar years involved fewer bullets, but in many ways, they were no less eventful than the war-torn ones. Now, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Everyone in the past seems to have known each other, and Adrian added some more evidence to that theory by bumping into his fair share of important historical figures over the years. After the war ended, he was tasked with leading the British military mission to Poland, a diplomatic program set up to help the newly formed Second Polish Republic fight off the combined post-war threats of the Soviets, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, and the Czechs. During that time, he worked closely with a Catholic called Achille Ratti. That name might not be familiar to you, but the one he adopted 3 years later probably will be: Pope Pius XI. Adrian's time in Poland was split between diplomatic and frontline duties, but nevertheless he still managed to have his fair share of mishaps, and being the man he was, those mishaps almost invariably involved some kind of mortal peril. He survived a plane crash, fought off an attack on a supply train from a Soviet cavalry force, got locked up in a Lithuanian prison, and he got himself involved in at least one duel, though admittedly he was only the second of one of the duelists. Incidentally, his opposite number, the other second, turned out to be a chap called Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim. More than 20 years later, Mannerheim would become the 6th president of Finland. Like I said, everyone in the past knew each other. The military mission to Poland was wound up in the early 1920s, and in 1923, at the age of 43, Adrian decided it was time to wind up his military career. In truth, he didn't really want to stop fighting, but he fell out with the British War Office over his next posting, and well, that was that. During his time leading the military mission, Adrian had fallen in love with his surroundings, and rather than move back to England, he instead decided to make a new life for himself in Poland. By the time of his retirement, he was an extremely senior figure in the army, and befitting his rank, he'd had a number of so-called aides-de-camp, highly qualified officers who were essentially elite personal assistants. One of them was a man named Karol Radziwill, who just so happened to be a Polish prince. During his time working under Adrian, Radziwill inherited a vast estate in the Pripyat marshes, which at the time were in Poland and today span the border of Ukraine and Belarus. On hearing that his old boss wanted to settle down in the local area, young Prince Radziwill offered him a handsome house on an island in the middle of the estate. When Adrian inquired as to how much the rent on this princely property would be, the prince merely laughed. There would be no rent. The house was a gift. Adrian would go on to live there for the following 15 years, during which time he essentially became a fully fledged Polish nobleman. He filled his days with hunting and fishing and spent his nights at grand feasts and even grander balls in the Polish equivalent of Downton Abbey. For an outdoorsman with a love of guns, it was paradise. And had history not intervened, Adrian would very likely have spent the rest of his life there. But as the 1920s rolled into the 30s, a big black cloud was gathering in nearby Germany, and that cloud's name was Adolf. In July 1939, Adrian received a phone call out of the blue from the British War Office, summoning him back to Blighty. Like James Bond in No Time to Die, the grizzled old veteran was being called out of retirement to help face a new threat. Soon enough, he was back in his old job as head of the British military mission in Poland. But he wouldn't be there for long. Just 2 months later, Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and 2 weeks after that, the Soviets invaded from the east. Adrian only just made it out alive. He pulled everyone from the British military mission out of the country a few days after the Germans invaded. But during the evacuation, Luftwaffe planes strafed a convoy, killing the wife of one of his men. Over the following couple of years, he served in both Norway and Northern Ireland, and despite the fact that he was pushing 60 at this point, he still saw plenty of action. During a disastrous 2-week campaign in Norway, he and his men were accidentally left stranded without guns or equipment 80 miles north of Trondheim, where they were soon being bombarded from the sea, bombed from the air, and ambushed by German ski troops on a daily basis. Despite being vastly outnumbered and hopelessly outgunned, Adrian and his men held the position for 2 weeks before eventually being evacuated by the Royal Navy. In early 1941, he was sent to Yugoslavia to help the locals stave off an imminent invasion from the rampaging German forces. But on the way to take up this new post, his aeroplane suffered a catastrophic engine failure, crash landing about 1.5 miles off the coast of Libya, at the time controlled by Axis power Italy. Adrian was knocked unconscious in the crash and only came to when the chilly waters of the Mediterranean Ocean covered his face. Being a one-armed, one-eyed sexagenarian, you'd think crashing a plane a mile from land would have posed a bit of a problem. But despite being eligible for a state-issued bus pass, Adrian Carton de Wiart was no ordinary pensioner. Not only did he survive the swim to shore, he even managed to help several of his fellow passengers who'd suffered serious injuries in the crash to do the very same. Unfortunately, when the tired crew finally made it to dry land, they were promptly captured and arrested by the Italians. I'm going to go out on a limb here and guess that Adrian was the only 60-year-old British Belgian with one hand and one eye in the entire army at the time. So it probably shouldn't come as much of a shock that the Italians soon realised who he was. Recognising his importance as a potential bargaining chip with the Allies, they sent him back to Italy, where he was imprisoned in the imposing Vinciliata Castle, a medieval fortress tucked away in the hills outside Florence. Conditions for the prisoners were pretty good. They were housed in ordinary rooms rather than prison cells, but despite their relative comfort, not to mention his age and fairly serious physical handicaps, Adrian wasted no time whatsoever in trying to escape. In fact, during his 3-year internment at the castle, he and several other inmates tried to break out no fewer than 5 times. After every failed attempt, the Italians added additional layers of security, a new wall around the prisoner's compound, extra guards, a set of powerful floodlights, and finally, a barbed wire fence. Eventually, Adrian realised that escaping over the castle wall was going to be next to impossible. Instead, he came up with a new plan. If he couldn't go over the wall, he was just going to have to go under it. Vinciliata Castle only ever housed the most high-ranking prisoners of war. That meant that there were only around 25 inmates there at any one time. But it also meant that those inmates were some of the brightest military minds that the Allies had to offer, and the 5th and final escape plan they came up with was pure brilliance. Food from the castle's kitchens was brought up to the prisoners every day by way of a small lift. The lift was only ever used at mealtimes. The rest of the day and night, it sat unused on the ground floor. In that position, the prisoners discovered that they were able to drop down the lift shaft on top of the lift, and from there they had access to a section of wall that was completely invisible to the guards. Who needs Rita Hayworth? As luck would have it, this hidden section of wall backed onto a disused chapel that had been completely sealed off from the outside. The perfect place to dig a tunnel. Only 6 men, Adrian included, planned to actually escape, but almost all of the inmates helped out with the plan. Some chipped in with the digging itself, whilst others kept watch, ringing a small bell if they saw any guards approaching. Others still were in charge of distraction tactics. For obvious reasons, the prisoners had no access to proper tools, so most of the digging was done with a couple of broken kitchen knives and a pilfered crowbar. The crowbar in particular was very loud, so the prisoners would make as much noise as possible whenever it was being used. They chopped wood, made random repairs to things that weren't broken, and even chased the castle's hens around the courtyard to get them clucking. Once on the outside, the escapees were going to need believable-looking identity papers. One of the prisoners was a bit of a painter, and the art-loving Italian guards happily provided him with all matter of inks and paints, which he duly used to make various forged documents of the highest quality. The documents were practically indistinguishable from the real thing, but there was one small problem: the identity photos. In the end, they came up with an absolutely ingenious solution to this little stumbling block. Being prisoners of such high rank, they were afforded certain luxuries, including a record player, for which they were allowed to order a variety of records. As it happens, many of the Italian records of the era included portraits of the artists who played on them, and so the prisoners ordered as many of the records as possible. Then, when they found a singer or musician who looked a bit like them, they carefully cut out the portrait and stuck it on the identity papers. After 7 months of non-stop effort, the tunnel was finally ready. The plotters waited for a stormy night with plenty of wind and rain to cover the sounds of their escape. Then they made their move, leaving crude dummies in their beds in case the guards happened to check in on them. 20 minutes later, they were free. The escapees split into groups of 2 and headed in different directions to increase their chances of someone getting away safely. 4 of the 6 headed to nearby train stations, hoping to make a quick getaway before the alarm was raised. But Adrian didn't dare take public transport. He was about as distinctive looking as it was possible to be, and he thought it was too dangerous to risk public spaces. Instead, he and another prisoner, Dick O'Connor, planned to make their escape through the Italian countryside to Switzerland, close to 200 miles away, on foot. Just to remind you, Adrian was 63 at this point, missing a hand and an eye, and he didn't speak a word of Italian. And yet, somehow, he and Dick managed to avoid capture for a full 8 days, during which time they covered over 150 miles of open country. Sadly, they were eventually picked up by Italian soldiers and sent straight back to the castle, where they were treated to a month apiece in solitary confinement for their troubles. No doubt more escape attempts would have followed, but shortly after emerging from solitary confinement, Adrian was abruptly separated from his fellow prisoners and sent to Rome without so much as an explanation. There, he was given the finest food Italy has to offer, in other words, some of the finest food in all of the world, and fitted up in a handmade Italian suit. Well-fed and suitably attired, a high-ranking Italian general finally appeared to explain just what the hell was going on. It was the summer of 1943, and the war was going badly for the Italians. Mussolini had been arrested following the Allied invasion of Sicily, and the Italians were keen to get out of bed with Mr. Hitler as soon as humanly possible. And that's where Adrian came in. The Italians wanted to surrender to the Allies, but to do so publicly would have risked Hitler's legendary wrath. Instead, they wanted Adrian to travel to Lisbon on their behalf to negotiate with the British. In other words, he was being set free to broker one of the most important deals of the entire war. As fate would have it, he never did actually negotiate the surrender. The Italians had sent several men on that very same mission in case any happened to be intercepted by the Germans, and someone else got there first. The Italians formally surrendered on the 3rd of September 1943, and Adrian returned to England for the first time in more than 2 years the very next day. Despite the fact he hadn't actually been involved in the Italian armistice, the press had somehow picked up his name, and for a couple of weeks, he became something of a minor celebrity. But fame and fortune were never going to suit a man like Adrian, especially not when there was still a war on. That's right, after all he'd been through, he was still itching to get back into the fight, and an opportunity to do exactly that came a couple of weeks later when he received a personal letter from some bloke by the name of Winston Churchill. Incidentally, legendary British Prime Minister Winston Churchill ended up being such an admirer of our man Adrian that in later life he personally wrote the foreword in his autobiography. How's that for an endorsement? Anyway, this note turned out to be a summons to the Prime Minister's famed country retreat in Buckinghamshire, known as Chequers. And it was there that Churchill explained his plan to send Adrian to China as his personal representative in order to help improve failing Anglo-Chinese relations. Knowing next to nothing about China, Adrian wasn't entirely sold on the idea, but Churchill wasn't a man to say no to, and so, less than 2 months after returning to Britain, Adrian found himself on his way to Asia. He stayed there until the end of the war, and whilst his new role was firmly diplomatic in nature, he still managed to get himself into a few scrapes. China is a massive country, and so Churchill ordered that Adrian should have his own private plane to get around. He used it on many a diplomatic mission, as intended, but when he wasn't busy sweet-talking the Chinese, he also used it to pick up various supplies from across the continent. On one of these supply runs, he flew to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, to fill up the empty bomb chambers of his plane with what he liked to call liquid propaganda. In other words, whiskey. But on the way home, the plane was forced to make a crash landing with Adrian and his precious cargo inside. But somehow, both survived the unplanned landing relatively unscathed. After the Second World War came to a close, Britain's new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee, asked Adrian to stay on in China, where there were increasing concerns about the rise of communism. Those concerns were obviously well placed, and Adrian himself quickly developed a deep-seated hatred for all things communist. So much so that he once famously interrupted a prominent communist speaker at a dinner party to explain just how much he hated communism and everyone who supported it. For a moment, the speaker looked furious, but then he just laughed. By the way, his name was Mao Zedong, better known these days as Chairman Mao. I'm telling you, all the important people in the past knew each other. 2 years after the end of the Second World War, at the age of 67, Adrian Carton de Wiart retired for the second and final time. His wife? Remember her? Yeah, me neither. Well, she passed away 2 years later in 1949. 2 years after that, at the age of 71, he married again, this time to a woman called Ruth Myrtle Muriel Joan McKechnie. Yeah, I think he must have had a name fetish or something. Considering everything he went through in life, it's a minor miracle that Adrian made it to old age. But that's exactly what happened. He and his new wife settled down in Southern Ireland, not far from Cork. Again, we don't really know all that much about his personal life during those final years, but we do know that he didn't meet his maker until 1963, when he was 83 years of age. Despite his noble birth, he died with very little money in his bank account, though I'm guessing his large collection of medals would have fetched a pretty penny. He ended his 40-year military career with more than 20 of them. The most impressive was undoubtedly the Victoria Cross, the most prestigious decoration in the entire British honours system. The medal is awarded for extreme bravery in the face of adversity, which sums up the hero of this story rather nicely. By all rights, Adrien Carton de Vriard should be a household name. He lived one of the most remarkable lives in modern history, and yet mention his name at the dinner table this evening, and unless you happen to live with some seriously enthusiastic military history nerds, I'm willing to bet nobody will have heard of him. Those that have likely know of him simply as the unkillable soldier, which is a bit of a shame really, because he was so much more than that. In fact, as far as I'm concerned, he was quite simply the most interesting man in the world. Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.